right, psyched to be here. Sorry we're losing some people, hope you come back. I am going to need audience participation a little bit. So could you just raise your hands if you or someone you love has ever given birth? I just want to point out, if you're not raising your hand, you don't love your mother, right? Okay? We are going to talk about obstetric fistula, we're going to talk about gender inequality, we're going to talk about data. But I want to be really honest with you all. Like, I have a very clear objective being here. Besides supporting my friends from Exasol, I want to get some key support for our mission. And that means talent, tools, or techniques from the people in this room. And so I'm talking to you today with that objective. And the way I'm going to measure that is I'm going to aim that 50% of you will feel something today, that 30% will learn something, and that 10% will be motivated to do something. And so at the end of the talk, I'm going to ask for a show of hands for who falls into those categories, okay? So I was a data scientist before they called it data science. I studied operations research, which for those of you who don't know are linear programming, stochastic modeling, game theory, all kind of bundled together, focused on systems and enterprise. I worked in the private sector for a private equity firm, and we made a lot of money, and with a sort of mid-20s, I kind of figured out the code for the science of achievement, but had completely missed the art of fulfillment. So I had to kind of reboot and figure out what was I going to do and how I was going to redirect my life. And I was very inspired by the American Civil Rights Movement and the idea that we as humanity are all one thing, right? That anything that affects anyone affects all of us, especially with regards to injustice and inequity. And I wanted to throw my whole self, my whole life at some gross injustice. But you know, I'm privileged, born in the United States, and I did not see that kind of injustice until I discovered this condition that we're going to talk about. And despite knowing very little, I really took the leap. And so I wanted to really highlight how I really knew nothing, you know, and I want to really push that home, because you all have something to give, and you might think, I don't really understand Africa, or I don't really understand health, but it doesn't matter. Like, you have skills that are absolutely applicable. So the problem that we're focused on is a problem that is as old as time, okay? Everyone in this room has someone in their family history who's had this injury. It's just a matter of how many generations you're going to go back. And this is actually the first woman who ever had fistula. It's Queen Henhenette. Her 4,000-year-old body was mummified, and they actually discovered a fistula in her mummy remains. So that's as far back as we have confirmed evidence of fistula existing. So the condition is called obstetric fistula. Very ugly sound, very ugly to have. Obstetric meaning childbirth-related, fistula meaning unnatural connection. So what happens is women or a girl who needs a cesarean labors for many days. She doesn't get that, or doesn't get a very good cesarean. And what happens is the baby dies, and on top of the excruciating loss of a child, the woman wakes up wet, and she stinks. And it's because there is an unnatural connection between her bladder and her birth canal, or her rectum and her birth canal, or both. So she's now leaking stool from her most intimate parts. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation has put on this huge game theory-oriented survey to try to determine the burden of disease and to make comparable values between different conditions, and has judged that rectovaginal fistula is as bad as amputation of both legs with no treatment, right? So that's how bad it is to have this. I mean, you can imagine just the leaking would be terrible, but the social implications are really devastating. These women become really modern-day lepers. They beg on the margins of society for food and for an opportunity to survive. Many don't survive. We have very poor data on this, so we don't even know how many women have it. Our best guess is 1 million, and 1 million women who have it, the prevalence, and about 50,000 new cases every year. So that's the bad news. The good news is that we have known how to treat it for over 150 years. The picture that you see on the screen is the first fistula treatment hospital in New York City, where women came from around the world to get this treatment, and this was eradicated in the United States, and they knocked that hospital down. And does anyone have any guess what they built in its place? No? No guesses? The Waldorf Astoria. Okay? So that's how long ago we ended this in the United States. Now, what the sad thing is that we have this super high impact procedure. It's 90% effective. The same surgery that we used back in old time New York City is 90% effective, and it only costs a couple $100. But we only treat about 16,000 women a year. That's our best guess. So we're not even reducing the backlog, right? So we're not even clearing enough cases to reduce the backlog. So when I discovered this, I thought, wow, this is the worst thing I've ever heard of. And it's the most concrete and addressable injustice, and let's just go all in, right? So Operation Fistula has a time-bound mission to find, treat, and reintegrate every woman everywhere. So we're going to try to find every one of those 1 million women and get them treated. And we need to do that in the next 30 years. Like, I guess it's less than 30 now. So I want to tell you a little bit about how we do it, and then try to get your ideas on how we can do it better. So this map was made in 2012, and it was absolutely revolutionary for us because it showed us where people were working, okay? This was, using this, we cross-referenced these points on the map with where funders were funding, and we discovered that 80% of surgeons were not receiving any financial support. And we asked why. And it's because grants, the way international development works is grants are given, large grants are given to organizations who receive those grants, and those grants are highly specified. You can spend this much on personnel, you can spend this much on food, you can spend this much on transportation. And the donors want to have evidence that the money's been spent exactly as they specified. So the people who are actually on the receiving end have very little autonomy or ability to innovate on the ground. And we know from history that this is a shackle that makes innovation and improvement really, really difficult. So what we decided to do was flip that model upside down. And instead of giving grants and controlling how it's spent, we gave contracts. And we paid those contracts out as we got evidence. So we found good surgeons, we screened their capacity, and then we funded them on a per-case basis. So each one of those surgeons was given a little piece of paper, 1 page, front and back, 71 points of data. They would fill it out, take a photograph of the patient when she arrived, and a photograph when she was discharged. They would email that back to us. We would type it into Excel. We would check for any inaccuracies, troubleshoot any issues, and once the data was confirmed, we would issue unrestricted cash. Now, the surgeon could use it in any way they wanted, except for politics, religion, or terrorism. Can't use terrorism. No terrorism. So how did it work? Well, this is Fidel Rakoto Arivolonana, who is a surgeon in Madagascar, and he had spent 30 years having women come to him asking for help, and he had no idea what to do. He had no idea how to treat them, but he did his best. And his best wasn't amazing because he hadn't had any training. And when we met Fidel, we saw his desire to do great work, and we said, how can we help him? Let's give him our funding model where we have enough data to understand the complexity of cases he's doing and to redirect those complicated cases to higher skilled surgeons to focus him on the cases that he could handle. And in 1 year, Fidel did 75 cases. Not only did he do more than he'd ever done in the 30 years before, but he had higher quality, better outcomes. And we had enough data to understand where we should invest in Fidel. And that brought other partners to the table. He ended up getting a very prestigious international fellowship. He went to train in Ethiopia. He's now one of the best surgeons in the developing world, and he's a leader in his country. So Fidel is not the only person who, this is not an isolated sort of experience here. This is a chart of what we did in Madagascar. There are 50,000 women in Madagascar with obstetric fistula. The year before we started our pilot program, there were only 58 women in the whole country treated. We started our funding, and in the first year, it went to 245 cases. It was great, right? We kept doing the funding. The UN Population Fund was working with us, and we jumped up to 513. Now, we stopped funding. You know, people say, well, you're giving the money, of course they're going to do it. What happens when you stop giving the money? Well, by this time, we'd catalyzed a lot of activity. Other partners had come to the table. And the first year after we stopped funding, and there were no more cash incentives, it jumped up to 829. Well, one of the big partners started to move out of the country, and we thought it's going to go down. But it didn't go down. It kept going up. And we just got the news 2 weeks ago that it's still going up. So this is a very catalytic effect on systems growth. But the biggest impact is for the women. We use a measure called disability-adjusted life years. This is an objective measure of the reduction of the burden of disease. And just to give you a sense of like the high impact of this, right? On average, women lived with this condition for 6.4 years, and the corrective surgery took 80 minutes. 80 minutes to fix them, and that correction reduced their disability by 10 years. So it essentially gave them back 10.6 years of healthy life. Now imagine what you would pay for an extra decade of healthy life, right? I mean, $200. I mean, that's pretty compelling, right? So beyond that, we discovered that fistula was very indicative of systemic failure and gender inequality. Now, specifically, the most profound levels of gender inequality in the developing world are crimes of apathy, maternal mortality. Women die from things that they shouldn't die from. Gender-based violence. That can take the form of domestic violence, female genital cutting, child marriage, which is a very friendly way to say a very terrible thing. And what we discovered in terms of our fistula patients was that their experiences informed us about how the system had failed. So in this case, in our pilot, 20% of the women we treated, 1 in 5, had their first child at 16 or younger. Like, let that sink in, like 20%, right? Of the overall population, 68% had their first child as teenagers. And of that population, 62% within 3 years of their first period. So just as they became hormonally able to have babies, the vast majority of the population is pregnant. But the most stunning statistic that we discovered was that C-section, the thing that should prevent fistula, actually caused fistula for 31% of women who we treated who had had C-sections. Now, this is a pretty stunning statistic and one that the government of Madagascar got pretty excited about. Now, imagine having the ability to have patients inform you exactly where the system is not working, and then you can target your investment to improve the facility improve the capacity at that facility. And so based on this, the government of Madagascar gave us a contract to expand our model across the continuum of care. So rather than just funding surgeons, we start to fund the nurses who support them in the clinical setting. We have to have patients to treat, so we have to fund the community workers to bring them into to care, and we have to fund social workers to reintegrate them after care. So we thought, right, this expansion, how are we going to manage this, right? There's a lot of moving parts, there's a lot of different stakeholders, there's a lot of information. Let's look first at what our sector does. How do we manage data? So we thought, let's build a data warehouse, and we looked at what people do to build data warehouses, and this is kind of how it works, right? Loads of paper, nothing's digitized, and we said, how do we manage? Let's build a dashboard, and this is the best dashboard we saw, right? Like literally pins on the board. The efforts are absolutely, well-intended, but the technology that we have access to in the charitable sector is pretty weak, Most people use open source technologies. Quite frankly, they're too expensive. They're not really free. You have to have consultants to integrate them. The level of investment in the tools is pretty low. And so I went back to my private sector days and said, why don't we, use what we would have used in a factory? And it turns out the technology is like miles better. So we started to design this use of technology, and it basically is like this. We have a tool called ComCare, which is a data collection tool that goes out in the field. It works offline. We're trialing a couple different data collection tools, but we're currently using ComCare. Exasol then pull that data out of ComCare and plant it into Exasol, which we also have the power to marry a lot of other data sets, which I'll talk about in just a second. And then, with the speed of Exasol and the organization of it, we're able to then run different activities in Alteryx and in Tableau. And this whole infrastructure has been built by volunteers. We've had Nico Cerrone. I don't know if any of you know him formerly from the Information Lab, now at the World Food Program. He helped structure a lot of this. Eva, when we needed help with the data, was like immediate to ask how they could help us, and we met with Aaron. He was really supportive, and Karsten helped architect this, and Nitin built out a ton of stuff for us. It was extremely helpful, and now we've pulled in Nalidi, who's working full-time for Operation Fistula and tying this whole thing together. So it started very much as a voluntary effort, and this is the beginning, really. There are many more tools, there are many more techniques that all of you will know, and you'll know how to plug in for this effort. And so really what we really need is more of your help, because we are now having a deep amount of patient data coming in from one region of Madagascar. This data is starting to flow in across the continuum of care. The UN Population Fund has also funded us to bring this effort to 5 new countries. In fact, I just came back from Nepal 2 days ago in order to come here. And we're starting to get, no one's ever used BI in global health at this scale. You'll hear some good presentations later about Path, who's really led the way in this. But we're starting to get data sets that are pretty massive, like population data sets from the UN, like census data, disease surveillance data from the WHO, where they have sites around the country collecting these different disease surveillance. Mixed data, which is mixed indicator data from UNICEF, which are household data, and then the demographic health surveys from the US government. These are huge data sets, and if we use Fistula within that broader data set, we can start to use Fistula as a predictor of maternal mortality, for example, which brings me to, just from my friends from Sweden, in Europe, if you go back in history, there was a great deal of maternal death here in Europe. And the first country to ever make significant gains in that was the poorest country, and that was Sweden. And the way that Sweden did that is they had the most developed census data, like very detailed census data, which they made freely available to every community. And they supported those communities to analyze that data and determine what specifically was causing that maternal mortality. They didn't give them any money, they just gave them access to information. And those people figured out ways to reduce that with no support, and they leapt ahead every other country in the continent with the least investment. And we believe that this is how we're really going to change global health. It's not going to be throwing money at it. It's going to be giving people close to the problem resources to solve it. And that doesn't just mean money. That means information, insights. It means analytics, like the power that's in this room channeled into those people. That's what we believe is really going to change the needle here. And specifically, some of you may know Hans Rosling, who passed away. Well, Hans, in partnership with one of my mentors from the Gates Foundation, believed that Fistula was a better predictor for maternal mortality than the maternal mortality ratio, which is an incredibly expensive statistical exercise to make maternal death comparable between countries. And we started to develop a plan that would use Fistula to actually more actionably predict maternal mortality in different countries. But to do this, we need more data science capacity. We need more technical analytics capacity. So in general, the world has lots of need, in more dimensions than Fistula. I mean, we're looking at Fistula and gender inequality, but it really cuts across a broad swath. So pretty much anything you might be remotely interested in, there's a need for that. And you have the ability to do something about that. I mean, you literally have the capability in this room. I was thinking about it as I was sitting here. and I was thinking you could probably literally save easily save 1 million years of disability. Just the capacity in this room, even with little knowledge, with some slight direction. So you have the ability, you have abilities that are enormous. So the world has need, you have ability, like what's your response? What are you going to do with that, right? So that's what I want to challenge everyone here today. So that's me, I'm done, but I'd just like to get a show of hands. Anyone who felt something, except boredom, can you raise your hand? I think that's more than 50. Anyone who learned something? Yeah, definitely more than 30. Anyone who wants to do something? All right, everybody who's raised their hands. I will be here. Nalidi, would you just stand up so people can see Nalidi here? We are going to talk to every one of you who raised your hands and said you want to do something. You come and talk to us, because we're going to figure out a way to get you involved. So thank you very much.